The morning of November 22, 1963, dawned with a deceptively perfect Texas sky. Bright, clear, and unseasonably warm. Dallas, a city with a complex, often hostile political landscape toward President John F. Kennedy, had dressed itself in an uneasy mixture of anticipation and anxiety. This visit was intended to mend fences within the fractured Democratic Party ahead of the 1964 election, but for a moment it felt like a simple, joyous parade. When Air Force One touched down at Love Field at 11:40 a.m., the air crackled with excitement. The primary objective for the Secret Service was to transport the president from the airport to the Trade Mart, where he was scheduled to speak at a luncheon. The chosen route, meandering 10 miles through the heart of the city, was intentionally designed to maximize exposure. It was a calculated political move, transforming a quick transit into a rolling rally, allowing thousands of Texans a glimpse of the charismatic young president and his glamorous wife, Jacqueline, dressed impeccably in a pink Chanel suit. The presidential limousine, an open-top 1961 Lincoln Continental, was the center of attention. President Kennedy, seated alongside the First Lady, waved and smiled, repeatedly asking the driver to slow down so he could greet the burgeoning crowds. The motorcade flowed smoothly through the suburban neighborhoods and then onto Main Street in downtown Dallas, where the throngs were thickest. Bank clerks leaned out of high-rise windows, paper snow fluttering down as makeshift confetti. The noise was a blend of cheers, applause, and the roar of the engines, all soaking up the deceptive warmth of the midday sun. At 12:29 p.m., the procession reached the final, fateful turns. It moved down Main Street, a corridor of happy chaos, before turning sharply right onto North Houston Street. This turn introduced the motorcade to Dealey Plaza, an oddly peaceful park-like setting nestled beneath the approaching triple underpass. The atmosphere here was different, less frantic, framed by the austere red brick warehouse of the Texas Schoolbook Depository to the right, and the grassy, oak-dotted slope of the knoll to the left. As the limousine completed the turn onto Houston, Governor John Connally's wife, Nellie, seated just ahead of the Kennedys, turned back. She saw the president smiling, soaking up the adulation. "Mr. President, you certainly can't say that Dallas doesn't love you." His final public words, uttered just moments before the world tilted, were, "No, they certainly can't." The convertible slowed dramatically, executing the final critical 120-degree left turn onto Elm Street. The official route now dictated a straight, gentle slope underneath the triple underpass and onto the Stemmons Freeway. For a brief, agonizing instant, the limousine was forced to travel at a crawl, heading directly toward the triple underpass and directly away from the towering, ominous vantage point of the Texas Schoolbook Depository's 6th floor. It was a path dictated by logistical necessity, the fastest way to the freeway, but in the lens of history, it became a path inexorably leading toward destiny. The bright sun overhead cast long, sharp shadows, and at 12:30 p.m., the calm was shattered by the distinct metallic cracks that forever silenced the cheers and changed the course of a nation. The shift from joyous celebration to unimaginable terror took place in less than 10 seconds. As the presidential limousine, having executed the critical turn onto Elm Street, began its slow downhill descent toward the triple underpass, the first shot rang out. It was a sharp, distinct crack that momentarily confused the thousands gathered in Dealey Plaza. To many, it sounded like a firecracker or a motorcycle backfiring. President Kennedy, raising his hands toward his throat, immediately reacted to the impact of the bullet that traversed through his neck. A pause, agonizingly brief, settled over the scene, a moment of frozen disbelief.
Testimony from hundreds of witnesses in sifting through volumes of forensic evidence collected by federal and state agencies. Their proceedings, though intended to be thorough, were criticized for their secrecy and for seemingly prioritizing the comfort of a singular, simple conclusion over the messy ambiguity of a potential conspiracy. On September 24, 1964, the Warren Commission delivered its 888-page report to President Johnson. Its central conclusion was stark, concise, and immediately controversial. Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, was the sole assassin. The report asserted that Oswald fired 3 shots from a $21 mail-order rifle from the 6th floor window of the Texas School Book Depository. It detailed the trajectory of the bullets, explaining the complex series of wounds inflicted upon President Kennedy and Governor Connally, with what it termed the single bullet theory, quickly dubbed the magic bullet theory by skeptics. This theory postulated that one single bullet, the second one fired, passed through 7 layers of tissue and bone in both men, remaining in near pristine condition. The commission concluded that Jack Ruby, Oswald's killer, also acted alone, motivated by his own patriotic rage and grief. The verdict was absolute. There was no domestic or foreign conspiracy. While the government intended the report to be the final word, it instead became the primary catalyst for decades of doubt. The speed of the investigation, the reliance on the shaky magic bullet scenario, and the failure to fully explain Oswald's own background and motives generated immediate and profound skepticism among the public and critics. Furthermore, the decision to withhold certain evidentiary documents for decades only fueled the flames of conspiracy theories, suggesting that the commission's true goal was not to uncover the truth, but to reassure a frightened public with a convenient lie. The Warren Commission's narrative successfully offered a quick, clean resolution. A disturbed former Marine, a lone, disgruntled figure, was responsible. This framing was crucial for Cold War America, preventing a terrifying escalation of international tensions. However, in the long run, the report irrevocably eroded public trust in official government institutions. It fostered a deep-seated belief that a hidden truth lay beneath the surface, ensuring that the legacy of the assassination would forever be defined not by closure, but by the relentless, skeptical pursuit of the real story. Of all the findings presented by the Warren Commission, none has generated more skepticism, ridicule, and deep-seated conspiracy theorizing than the concept known officially as the single bullet theory and popularly as the magic bullet. It is the absolute linchpin of the lone gunman verdict, yet its mechanics strain the limits of credibility for millions of Americans. The scenario the Commission presented was necessary to fit the known evidence. According to the medical and ballistics evidence, 2 men, President John F. Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally, were severely wounded by shots fired from the Texas School Book Depository. Since Lee Harvey Oswald was definitively linked to only 3 fired cartridges and the 3rd shot was indisputably fatal to Kennedy, the wounds sustained by both men had to be accounted for by the first 2 projectiles. When investigators determined that the first shot likely missed entirely, the responsibility for 7 separate entry and exit wounds fell to the second shot. This second bullet, officially designated Commission Exhibit 399, CE 399, was tasked with an impossible journey. The Warren report theorized that as the presidential limousine passed in front of the book depository, Oswald's second shot struck President Kennedy high on the back. It then traveled upwards at a steep angle, exiting his throat just below the Adam's apple. Incredibly, according to the theory, this same bullet did not stop there. Continuing its flight,
further bolstering the grassy knoll theory was the controversial acoustics evidence. Years after the Warren Report, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, HSCA, analyzed a dictabelt recording from a Dallas police motorcycle radio. Acoustic experts concluded, with a high degree of probability, though later disputed by the National Academy of Sciences, that the sounds recorded indicated 4 shots were fired, with one of the shots having the echo pattern consistent with the firing location on the grassy knoll. The presence of a shot from the knoll is not merely about an extra bullet. It is the ultimate proof of a flanking shot, necessitating the involvement of at least one other gunman in coordination with Lee Harvey Oswald. It transforms the crime from the act of a single deranged individual into a premeditated multi-party ambush. For those who reject the Warren Commission's conclusion, the grassy knoll remains the indelible location of the hidden truth, the spot where the trajectory of the conspiracy began. In the terrifying chaos of Dealey Plaza, an unlikely figure held the key to decades of debate. Abraham Zapruder, a Dallas dress manufacturer and amateur filmmaker. Standing atop a concrete pedestal near the motorcade's path, Zapruder was filming the president's approach with his 8mm Bell & Howell movie camera. He captured 26.6 seconds of color film, a silent, sickening record that, when analyzed, frame by frame, became the single most crucial, contested, and disturbing piece of evidence in the assassination. The Zapruder film is not just a document of a tragedy, it is the ultimate tool of both the official investigation and the conspiracy movement. Its frames provide the most precise timeline of the shooting, allowing analysts to correlate the location of the limousine with the impact of each shot. The film captures the moment the limousine emerges from behind the Stemmons freeway sign, which briefly obscured the view, providing a clear sequence of the event from frame 207 to the final, fatal shot around frame 313. The film's silent narrative begins innocently, showing a smiling, waving president. At frame 225, the first unmistakable reaction to a bullet occurs. President Kennedy's arms jerk up toward his throat, a reaction consistent with the throat wound attributed to the first or second shot. Governor Connolly then reacts around frame 236, clutching his chest and collapsing. This crucial 11-frame, or approximately 0.6-second delay between the two men's reactions, became a central pillar for those rejecting the single bullet theory, arguing that a single bullet could not possibly have caused two separated reactions. However, the most analyzed and emotionally harrowing sequence occurs at frames 312 and 313. This is the moment of the third, fatal shot to the president's head. In frame 312, Kennedy appears relatively stable, leaning slightly forward. Then at frame 313, a horrifying blossom of blood and tissue erupts from the side of his head. Immediately afterward, the film shows the president's head and body being thrown violently backwards and to the left onto the rear seat. This powerful backward and left motion is what ignited and sustained the grassy knoll theories. In ballistics, a body recoils opposite the direction from which the force is applied. If the shot came from the Texas School Book Depository, the president's body should have been propelled forward and slightly right. The pronounced movement seen in the Zapruder film, however, strongly suggested to many medical professionals and physicists that the shot originated from the front, perhaps the grassy knoll, leading to a debate over kinetic energy, jet effects, and the physics of impact that continues to this day. The government, via the Warren Commission and later the House Select Committee on Assassinations, maintained that the backward motion was an involuntary neuromuscular shooter, forever cementing the idea that the truth was too complex to be contained by a single narrative. The official verdict of the Warren Commission settled the question of who killed President Kennedy, Lee Harvey Oswald. Yet the question of why, the true driving motive behind the assassination, has remained perpetually ambiguous, leaving a gaping void at the heart of the official narrative. Without a clear, rational motive, the idea that a single disillusioned man fundamentally changed the course of world history becomes difficult to accept, further fueling the conspiracy machine. Oswald's life before November 22, 1963, was a confusing tapestry of political contradictions, personal failures, and erratic movements. He was a former Marine who, despite his training, defected to the Soviet Union in 1959, renouncing his citizenship and living in Minsk for nearly 3 years. This defection painted him as a staunch communist sympathizer and a clear enemy of the state. However, upon returning to the United States with his Russian wife, Marina, his political allegiance seemed to shift, or at least become deliberately murky.
In the months leading up to the assassination, Oswald embraced the contradictory labels of Marxist, pro-Cuban, and a supporter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, an organization supporting Fidel Castro's regime. He even traveled to Mexico City, attempting unsuccessfully to obtain visas to travel back to Cuba or the Soviet Union. This flirtation with America's Cold War adversaries provided a surface-level motive, a disgruntled ideological extremist targeting the leader of the Western world. The Warren Commission generally adopted this view, painting Oswald as a sociopath, seeking infamy and revenge against the system that had rejected him. However, the simplicity of this political motive quickly unravels under scrutiny. Oswald was also known for his severe anger issues, his history of domestic violence, and a deep self-aggrandizing need for attention. Some analysts argue that the assassination was not politically motivated at all, but rather a final, desperate act of a man whose life was spiraling into failure, a grandiose gesture aimed at achieving the recognition he craved. The murder of police officer J.D. Tippit, whom Oswald killed shortly after the assassination, further muddied the waters, suggesting a mind panicked and unhinged, rather than one executing a carefully calculated political plot. Moreover, if the assassination was an act of political protest, Oswald's connections become immediately suspicious. Was his connection to pro-Castro groups genuine, or was he infiltrating them? Was his earlier association with U.S. intelligence agencies, a consistent theme in conspiracy theories, a key to a deeper motive? His own cryptic denials, "I'm just a patsy," immediately before his death, only served to amplify the questions surrounding his true role and motivation. Because Oswald was silenced by Jack Ruby before he could be fully interrogated or stand trial, the only person who could definitively answer the question of why was permanently removed. The lack of a clear, coherent, and singular motive means that historians, biographers, and conspiracy theorists are left to fill the vacuum with their own interpretations. This ambiguity is precisely what ensures that the enigma of Lee Harvey Oswald, the troubled figure at the center of the century's greatest tragedy, endures as a perennial, unanswered American question. Just 2 days after the assassination of President Kennedy, America witnessed another act of unbelievable violence, cementing the entire affair as a descent into chaos. On Sunday morning, November 24, 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald, the prime suspect and the supposed lone gunman, was being transferred by Dallas police from the city jail to the county jail. The transfer was set to be televised live, a decision driven by an overwhelming desire for transparency after the preceding days of terror. As Oswald, flanked by detectives, was led through the basement of the police headquarters, the moment of transition was brutally interrupted.
Mafia. It was entirely plausible that if the U.S. was trying to kill Castro, Castro might have ordered a counterstrike against the American president. The figure of Lee Harvey Oswald added potent fuel to this theory. Oswald was not just an ideological Marxist, he was a vocal supporter of the Cuban Revolution. In the months leading up to the assassination, he publicly distributed Fair Play for Cuba committee leaflets in New Orleans and, critically, traveled to Mexico City in late September 1963. While there, he visited both the Cuban and Soviet embassies, allegedly attempting to secure visas. Though the details of his meetings remain murky, the implication was clear. Oswald was attempting to deepen his communist connections just weeks before he shot the president. Was he receiving instructions? Was he serving as a hired gun for a desperate regime? Conversely, the assassination was also blamed on anti-Castro exiles. These fiercely anti-communist Cubans, many of whom had fought at the Bay of Pigs, felt profoundly betrayed by President Kennedy. They believed Kennedy had abandoned them on the beaches of Cuba, leading to a humiliating failure and the consolidation of Castro's power. To the exiles, Kennedy was an enemy who had to be punished. The prospect of a rogue cell of bitter, well-trained exiles, many of whom had military experience and were operating in the fringes of the U.S. intelligence community, carrying out the assassination was a powerful alternative to the official story. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, HSCC, ultimately the ARRB, working diligently throughout the 1990s, managed to release millions of pages of documents from the CIA, FBI, and various other agencies, shedding light on intelligence operations against Castro and the mafia's desire to kill Kennedy. Yet the 2017 deadline proved to be another moment of institutional failure. Despite the law's clear directive, President Donald Trump, citing national security concerns urged by the CIA and FBI, postponed the release of thousands of remaining records. Subsequent presidents have continued to delay the final, complete disclosure, releasing documents in dribs and drabs while claiming hundreds of files still contain information too sensitive for public view. The rationale behind the continued secrecy is as compelling as it is frustrating. The CIA and FBI argued that the files contain information identifying still living foreign intelligence sources and methods that could compromise current operations. Conspiracy theorists, however, posit that the withheld documents contain smoking guns, evidence detailing the coordination between government elements, the mafia, or perhaps the truth about Oswald's handlers. This perpetual delay ensures that the ghost of the conspiracy remains unexorcised. Every time a tranche of files is released, the public devours them, searching for the definitive proof that has been suppressed. And every time the release is blocked or postponed, the core belief of a deliberate cover-up is reinforced. The battle for declassification has become an enduring symbol of the American public's right to know and the government's powerful capacity to conceal, guaranteeing that the full truth about the Kennedy assassination remains perpetually shrouded in a labyrinth of secrecy. For a crime as meticulously documented as the Kennedy assassination, the most damning evidence of a cover-up is often found not in political maneuverings, but in the glaring inconsistencies surrounding the medical evidence. The official autopsy, conducted at Bethesda Naval Hospital in Washington, D.C., and the emergency trauma care provided at Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas produced contradictory reports and missing materials that have fueled decades of suspicion that the facts were either deliberately obscured or the evidence was actively tampered with. The controversy began almost immediately upon Kennedy's arrival at Parkland. The trauma surgeons there, working frantically to save the president, noted a small entry wound in the back of his neck and a massive catastrophic exit wound in the back right portion of his head. Crucially, the Parkland doctors were convinced the bullet that struck the head entered from the front, consistent with a shot from the grassy knoll, due to the large explosion of bone and tissue at the rear of the skull. Their clinical observations were documented, but later clashed violently with the official autopsy findings. The official autopsy at Bethesda was conducted under controversial conditions. It was performed by military pathologists who were not experienced forensic specialists, and it was done under the immediate, direct supervision of military and Secret Service officials who often restricted the access of the pathologists. The final autopsy report concluded that both bullets entered from the back, one high on the back of the neck, consistent with the Texas School Book Depository, and the fatal one in the rear of the head. This conclusion directly supported the lone gunman theory, but required the pathologists to make a series of corrections and clarifications that fundamentally contradicted the findings of the Dallas doctors. The most shocking discrepancies revolve around physical evidence. The brain. The president's brain was removed during the autopsy and purportedly retained as evidence. However, when the House Select Committee on Assassinations, HSCA, investigated, they found that the brain specimen in the National Archives was incomplete and lacked crucial information could potentially expose poor judgment, operational mistakes, or, most critically to conspiracy theorists, direct involvement in a cover-up by individuals within the agencies. Every time a tranche of records is scheduled for release, as occurred under Presidents Trump and Biden, the CIA and FBI successfully lobby to have hundreds of documents withheld or heavily redacted, citing national security, the protection of intelligence methods, even outdated ones, and a need to honor past agreements with foreign governments. This reluctance is viewed not as reasonable security, but as an admission of guilt. Why, critics ask, would intelligence methods from the 1960s pose a threat today, unless those methods were used to commit a crime that is still being covered up?
The practical impact of this withholding is the perpetuation of the crisis of trust. Without full, unfettered transparency, the government will never be able to fully inoculate the public against conspiracy theories. The official narrative relies on the complete integrity of the evidence, yet the government's continued refusal to release all records suggests that the integrity is, in fact, flawed. The world still doesn't know the full story because a decisive layer of secrecy has been prioritized over historical clarity, ensuring that the assassination of JFK remains an open wound in the American psyche. The murder of President John F. Kennedy was more than a political tragedy. It was a profound psychic wound inflicted upon the American soul. Before November 22, 1963, a generalized, almost naive faith in government institutions and elected officials largely prevailed. Kennedy's charisma had symbolized hope, youth, and the boundless potential of the post-war nation. When he was struck down, the country lost its innocence, and the subsequent official attempts to explain his death shattered the collective sense of stability and truth. The immediate aftermath was one of shared national grief, but the Warren Commission's swift declaration of the lone gunman ignited a fierce, enduring skepticism. The narrative that a disturbed former Marine with a mail-order rifle could, acting alone, permanently alter the course of history was too simple, too convenient, and seemed fundamentally disproportionate to the magnitude of the event. The implausibility of the magic bullet, the conflicting testimonies surrounding the grassy knoll, and the suspicious swiftness of Jack Ruby's intervention fueled a deep popular rejection of the official story.